if somebody says to you, what you did to me in my birth has left me with long-standing trauma, the next question is, please explain to me, like, I want to understand that. What did I do that made you feel that way? And come from it from a place of, how can I make sure I never do this again? And just try
That's
and,
not what's happening.
no,
Instead, they're being like, that wasn't violence.
yeah,
That didn't hurt you. They're just completely gaslighting a whole generation.
yeah. And then women say, well, fine, if you're not going to listen, we're going to take this into our own hands. We're going to find a midwife or we're
Yeah.
going to free birth. We want out of this system that
Yeah.
refuses to serve us in the way we want to be served. And then when we are the victims of that system, they refuse to acknowledge that they've done anything wrong. So, I mean, women just are starting to realize and decide.
Before we dive into today's episode, we wanted to let you know about 2 upcoming Skills and Drills workshops with Augustine Colebrook in Spokane Valley and Fresno in February and March 2025. Skills and Drills is an immersive, round-robin training experience featuring 18 hands-on skill stations, lifelike models, and expert guidance from Augustine. Whether you're refining your technique or learning something new, this is the perfect opportunity to practice in a supportive and high-energy environment. The skill stations cover everything from phlebotomy and newborn exams to suturing, breech maneuvers, and so much more. Spots are limited, so please head on over to midwiferywisdom.com to register before tickets sell out.
Well, Melanie, I can't imagine people don't know who you are. You are an internet celebrity, but let's do introductions just in case.
It's so funny that you say I'm an internet celebrity because I don't know what goes on out there. I just keep making stuff and putting it out, and then people.
Well, that's what makes it good.
I know. And people are like, "Oh my gosh, it's you!" I'm like, "Me? What? Who is me?" So introductions, yeah. What would you like to know?
Well, my general prompt is tell us who you are, where you are, and what you're all about.
Okay, so I'm in Australia, in a place called the Blue Mountains, and the traditional custodians of this land are the Darug people. And who am I? My name's Melanie Jackson, Dr. Melanie Jackson, which is a title I'm not comfortable with, but I have a PhD, which is why I get to use it. I'm a registered midwife here in Australia. I have 2 babies who were both born at home, which makes total sense because I also work as a private midwife and have been doing that for 16 years. So here in Australia, if you're a private midwife, that means you are attending home births and doing full continuity of care for your own clients. What else? I'm married to Dan, who's the other partner in our company that we run. And what else? I love to garden and crochet. And you may have seen Pregnancy, the alter ego, who wears a full crocheted pregnancy suit with accurate anatomy. I have a wicked sense of humor, which is where that came from.
You have a what?
A bit of a wicked sense of humor. And I think that's where that pregnancy is allowed to shine.
Pregnancy. And the call to the internet to name her, that was a fun thing too. That was fantastic.
And pregnancy just came out of nowhere. So I was going to call her Pip, Pregnant Pip. And then almost like 24 hours into this naming journey, someone's like, it's right in the name, Pregnancy. I was like, oh, why did I not see this? So that's, yeah, that's
brilliant.
What
With more bush and an anus. That was the best episode ever. You do have a wicked sense of humor, but more than that, you are endearing while you are being all of the silliness. It's a fantastic quality, and I think you won the hearts and minds over.
Maybe, mostly. I did get a few messages of like, it's too much. I can't take it. I'm sorry. I have to go. And I was like, oh, okay. Probably this is not the space for you because I can't change. So yeah, farewell. But it's a nice way, I think, to address some really big issues in maternity care, a little bit tongue in cheek, where I think sometimes there's lots of topics in maternity care that can feel really heavy and traumatic for people. And if you can just take the edge off somehow, tastefully or not, I think it can just help open up conversations. So that was the intention behind pregnancy.
Yeah, it's really brilliant. And I think midwifery as a whole doesn't have very many of those ins, you know? We're either like, as a profession, as a group of colleagues, like I'm really generalizing here. I'm not saying you at all, but like I think in general, we're either really serious obstetric violence and, dignity and like maternity mortality, like we get very serious, or we're really like discounted, like patchouli and Birkenstocks. It's like they can't quite find a meaningful middle for us in the commentary. And somehow it's this brilliant combination of your continence and your tone of voice and your irreverence and whatever. Somehow you've sort of found this while being irreverent in some ways. And I love it. And we have very few mascots in midwifery. We have very few, like, we don't have like that thing that drives us home. And you really got us there this last year.
Wow, the midwifery mascot. It's a big crown to wear, but
It is. It's fantastic. Well, so aside from the midwives who like so completely get it, what you're trying to do you feel like this and other advocacy parts that you play have given you more tools?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think the big game changer in terms of, are you thinking tools in terms of like my work as
communication or connection, or like we have such a hard time, I think, getting a lot of the truth across without being so serious or discounted. And it feels like this was a really powerful tool. And I know you have other advocacy works in leading conferences and movements, and I just wondered, was this a part of that repertoire?
Yes, I think early on in my career, I realized I had a way with words, a way of explaining things that people could understand. And so I felt like there was a skill set in being able to read and understand and do research, which was certainly where I started, and then to interpret it for other people. And I've been doing that my whole career for my clients. For 16 years, I've been saying, here's some research, here's what it says, here's what this might mean for you, take it away and use it as you like. And then that's what gave birth to the podcast, the Great Birth Rebellion podcast, which I thought, wow, I'm spending actually hours and hours gathering information and preparing topic-based information for my own client load, which was, 30 or 40 women a year. And it just felt like a kind of a waste of effort. Not a total waste. It was beneficial to them, but it didn't go any further. And it wasn't until I started posting some very amateur videos on YouTube about some papers that I kind of thought, hang on, there's a real niche here of people who are explaining research to people in this way. And so did a few more, and then eventually thought, I'm going to write a book which kind of collects all this information. And my husband said, I don't know if a book is where it's at. I reckon you should do a podcast. And at the time, there was a few other very big podcasts. And I thought, well, no, I think there's no room for it. I think, there's people are already doing a good job at that. But then I thought, well, actually, I probably haven't got anything to lose. At the very least, I could direct my clients to these episodes, and it would be a record of things I've already researched. They could benefit from it, and then I can talk about other things in our appointments, so they can talk about other things in our appointments. That was the intention. And then when I launched it, it did quite well initially. I didn't know how many people would listen, but, the very first episode, there was kind of 900 people on the first day. And I thought, well, okay. I don't know how many I was expecting, but that seems nice. I had a co-host who was very energetic and a great, great person to bounce things off. And so it grew and grew and grew. And I just kept honing that skill of reading research and translating it into words that people could understand. And then people loved it.
Yeah.
So it's like anything, the more you do it, just the better you get. And I like to survey people, listeners, like, hey, is this all right? Does it sound okay? And everyone's like, we love it. There's obviously tweaks here and there, but yeah.
That's so powerful. And then this work of sort of gathering mamas and midwives through your podcast created a whole gathering last year.
Yes.
Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, we did. At first, it started actually this very small online gathering called the Assembly of Rebellious Midwives. So it was around the idea that the podcast was, midwives were contacting me saying, thanks so much for this information. We can't find it anywhere. It's so valuable to share with our clients. And then I thought, oh, actually, there's a lot of midwives out there who are appreciating this and thinking in a similar way. Maybe we can gather together online just to support each other. So I started the Assembly of Rebellious Midwives, and almost the first or second meeting, they were like, we want to get together. We don't want to just hang out online. We want to actually see each other. Can you do a conference? So I was like, oh, this is another thing my husband was kind of encouraging me to do, is run a conference. And I thought, well, there's sort of like 400 midwives in this online assembly. Surely maybe half of them would come to a conference. And so that's where the convergence of Rebellious Midwives was born, just this intentionality to want to meet with like-minded people. And we advertised it and we did it. And I kind of took some big risks in getting some great presenters out. Stu Fishbein from the US came, and, a lot of keynote speakers here in Australia were really keen and jumped on board and supported the whole idea of a convergence of rebellious midwives. And it was a great success. It was an incredible event. 375 people came. And so we're doing it again every year. That was a bit of a trial run. And so we're doing it again every August. And it'll be in Sydney again this year, but it could change. That venue could change in the coming years. But yeah, it just kind of was all born out of people wanting to get together.
Yeah, it's so awesome. And you being a connector is such a powerful role. Do you feel happy about this awareness of where you've landed? Because when you live kind of rurally and you serve 40 or 50 women a year and you just do your home birth little routine, it can feel like you're in a little bubble, and now your bubble is really big. And how does that feel?
Yeah, it's something I've grappled with, because my identity says you're a home birth midwife. And that's where I feel like my main skill set is. And I feel responsible to that, because it's very hard to get into that position here in Australia, to be an autonomous practitioner who can work privately. There's so many hoops to jump, and there's not very many of us. And so I kind of think, no, you're a home birth midwife. That's your role. It's important. But then as I started to peek out of the home birth community and realized there was all these people out there who, although they weren't having home births, had this really similar mindset, and midwives and women, then I realized that that amount of people that I could influence is so much broader than the 40 or so families who I could care for in a year. So I'm in this really conflicting space of, do I stay responsible to 40 families a year, or do I reckon, like, it makes a lot of sense when you look at the other work that I'm doing to see how many people are influenced through that work and how much bigger the change could be if I did that. So how does it feel? I feel confused as to what to do next, because I want to measure my career I don't want to be an influencer, but I want to influence the maternity care system. And I want people to benefit from, as many people as possible to benefit from my work, because I do think I do a good job at it. And I know people appreciate it. Like, I get a lot of great feedback. So it feels like a more impactful thing to do, to be putting things out publicly, like podcasts and YouTubes and like that, than to keep offering clinical care to 40 women a year. I mean, I still do that. I still look after women, not that many. But yeah, I'm in this really conflicted zone.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I get it.
I mean, my family too, like early on when my kids were little, they were, really securely, they were fine. Mum's gone, no worries, bye mum, we'll see you when you get back. And I'd come home and everyone's fine. And as they get older, they're 7 and 11, they're kind of asking more questions of like, why can't we do this? And I'm like, because I'm on call. And, they're getting less and less tolerant of the lifestyle that you have to lead as a private midwife. And so I'm drawn away from it for lots of reasons, none of which are my own reasons. Like, I really enjoy it. But yeah, I can just feel things changing that are telling me to go in a different direction. Yeah.
And the need is so great for the person from the inside advocating. And I think it would be great to have a little context. I lived in Perth for 6 months, and I got a little context into the Australian politics and the challenge of becoming a private midwife and insurance reimbursement. And like, I was sort of stunned to discover that Australian midwives can graduate without having suturing or IV skills, that's something you're expected to get on the way. And like, would you give us a little more context of like why it's so important that Australia has this advocacy right now? Because Australia is kind of on a tipping point, and it seems like there's momentum and things are really changing for the positive now. Is that true? Will you tell us a little more?
Yeah, it depends which angle you're looking at it from. So in Australia, we have a predominantly publicly funded system where women can have private insurance. They purchase that themselves, and you can access private practitioners using your insurance. Many of them don't cover private midwifery. It's more about getting access to private hospitals and private obstetricians. But for the most part, women in Australia will walk into a public hospital, have all of their medical bills taken care of by the government. It's completely free to have a baby, unless you want to choose a boutique service like a private midwife. We're not employed by a hospital, we're self-employed, so you'd be a sole trader or in a company model. Or a private obstetrician, again, they're self-employed and they work through public and private hospitals. And so women would pay out of pocket for some of these boutique services. But we are tracking on up to nearly a 40% cesarean section rate. And the births are kind of quite high intervention. We're not probably equivalent in terms of the medicalization of childbirth, similar to the US. And there's not a great understanding of the role of midwives. We're not kind of respected within the maternity care system as, I guess, primary care or autonomous care providers for women. But that's turning around a bit. So we've come a long way for private midwives. From when I started in 2009, we had no insurance, no visiting rights. It was you got a birth kit and you started saying to women, I can be your home birth midwife. And that's as far as the legislation went. Now there's a lot of barriers. Our registration body says we have to have 5,000 hours of clinical practice in order to be endorsed. We have to get additional qualifications in pharmacology and diagnostics. So we're going to go back to university for at 6 months to a year to get those qualifications. Then we can apply for endorsement so that we can get our professional indemnity insurance product. And obviously we're governed. Every midwife in Australia is regulated. There's no kind of unregulated way of being a midwife. It's a protected title. So you're either a registered midwife or you work as a birth worker under some other description. So that's the nutshell of it. But now we also, with that endorsement of midwifery, when you become an endorsed midwife, now we can get some money back from the public purse, which is called Medicare. So about a quarter of women's fees that they will pay a private midwife can be reimbursed through Medicare. We also have prescribing rights, which means that if a woman needs a medicine, we can write them a script and they can go to the pharmacy and get it, which is usually, restricted to doctors here in Australia. We can also send them for blood.
Can you give us an example of like what script that would be? Like,
well, say they need an antibiotic for a urinary tract infection, or we get, even for our stock, oxytocin, vitamin K, things like that. Sometimes, if they're having breastfeeding issues and they need some medicine to help boost their supply.
Fungal.
I don't do it very often. I don't find it's necessary very often, but it means they don't have to go to their GP, that all of their care can be provided.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So we have a lot of autonomy, and there used to be this barrier of what they called collaborative agreement, which basically the woman had to have a letter from a doctor or an obstetrician or a health service that said they are referring the woman to us for care. And if the woman couldn't get that letter, we couldn't care for them. And
historically, almost impossible to procure, right? Yes.
So, and women would go around to various GPs, and I was fortunate enough to have a few who knew me and who were willing every time to give a GP referral. But, one is now retiring and the other was uncertain, and somebody whispered in her ear and said, your insurance company is going to penalize you if something happens, and they'll get frightened. And there's nothing that requires GPs to refer to us. So it was very difficult. We had to get a referral, but there was nothing making sure that they would give them. So that recently got removed. So now in Australia, if you want to, if you can afford to and you've got access to, you can pay to see a private midwife from the very, very beginning. We can give you referrals for any blood tests or ultrasounds or any early pregnancy testing you want. You don't have to, the GPs aren't the gatekeepers anymore to accessing private midwifery care. But it's still inequitable because women pay out of pocket and there's only a small Medicare rebate. So, we're coming some ways a little bit, but there's still lots of barriers. And I don't think the change is happening fast enough, but it's happening. We do have some growing support for midwifery here in Australia.
Yeah, that is, at least there's not that barrier to care in that way. And there are public midwives employed by the hospitals, but it's my understanding they work as kind of hospitalists. They don't have their own patient load. They just work a shift and in some ways are more like labor nurses than they are independent. Is this true?
Well, so there's a few ways you can work. So majority will be employed by a hospital. And then there's a few models within a hospital. So there's sort of 14 to 16 public home birth programs. So a midwife could be employed by the hospital to take a caseload of women and attend them at home.
I think there was one at Fiona Stanley when I was there in Perth. Yeah, okay.
Yeah, but, they're very restrictive. So the hospital still decides what the criteria is for women who can join them and, the criteria where you can't continue care. So the midwives are still employed by the hospital. So there's restrictions, but they are able to offer a continuity model. There's also continuity of care programs, like midwifery group practice programs within hospitals. Again, they're governed by hospital policy and the midwives are employed by the hospital, but they can provide a continuity model. And then there's a kind of hybrid where you get your own midwife, antenatal, postnatal, but they're not on call for the birth. But the majority, about 70% of women who go to hospital will only be able to access what we call our fragmented system, where you arrive to the antenatal clinic, you will see anybody who's on shift that day. Similar when you turn up for birth, whoever's on the shift, and on the postnatal ward, they're just on shifts again, and whoever's there on the day will care for you. So that's the majority of what women will get in Australia. Obviously not the evidence-based option, but yeah.
Yeah, no, I was going to say that it seems like there's a lot of evidence. I did an interview with Hannah Dahlen in West Sydney, and she was really explaining that this is like evidence has been clearly demonstrated that continuity of care in any model has better outcomes than this fragmented system.
Absolutely. We know it. There's not even a doubt. We don't need to keep doing research on it. It's, but there's reluctance to adopt it.
Yeah. And so where does this come from? I mean, it seems to me like it's just such a no-brainer. And I understand where the reluctance comes in the US because it's a for-profit model and the powers that be don't want to give up their power. Is that the same in Australia? What's the motivation to fight this trend?
I think just historically, the medical model has got a hold on the authoritative knowledge around birth. So there's a fundamental belief that medical birth is better than birth managed any other way because everybody believes that medicine and hospitals keep us safe. And that's so, of course, but also the rhetoric behind that is that birth is dangerous. And so anytime you suggest that we move birth out of a hospital or away from medical management, this niggling voice is in people's heads of like, wait a second, birth is dangerous though. If we do that, that's going to increase danger. So there's a fundamental flaw in how we see birth because things can go wrong in birth. There's no doubt about that, in the same way as things can go wrong when you get in a car or anytime you have a child, we're at risk of them falling and hurting themselves and getting sick, and there's all these possibilities. But being pregnant and having a baby isn't fundamentally a pathological way of being. It's just a life stage. It's something we do that sometimes something goes wrong in, which is the job of midwives is to hover and supervise that journey and just tap a woman on the shoulder and go, ooh, I think this isn't normal anymore. Maybe we need more care. But that's not how our society sees birth. So I think there's a fundamental problem where where everybody thinks that birth is so dangerous that it has to be in hospital. And so any suggestion that we move away from that, it just almost doesn't compute in people's minds. And politicians and doctors are the ones who have the power in our society here about the care that women have access to. So it has to shift so many philosophical understandings. And in a way, doctors do not want to relinquish care of pregnant women to midwives, possibly because they so believe that their role is, I think they're assuming we need them more than we do. We do need them, but not for every pregnancy.
Well, the evidence is just so overwhelming. Like everywhere you look, from eons ago until modern days, like midwives save lives, full stop, in every culture that they're studied. So other than profit over people, how can there be a legitimate, like for me, it just feels like Australia has this public health system. Australia is a reasonably small population, 38 million or something like that. And it just seems like this should be so obvious. Like this should be implemented. Like, and also they have New Zealand nearby, where New Zealand has historically had very prominent midwifery practice. So like, why isn't this happening?
I know. And we see it. I think there's medical lobby groups who are invested in continuing the messaging around childbirth and wanting to keep control and power. So even if it's not about money, it could also be about power and status and keeping control of that. And I also, I can't fully explain the full picture of why people are so unwilling. But if we look at it at a micro level, if you want to change a policy about something in a hospital, then you're going to come up to barriers. For example, I had a colleague who was trying to put a home birth program into their local hospital. And the hospital said, if you want to do that, you have to have the backing of one of the obstetricians who will happily supervise this new model. And none of the obstetricians said they would do that. No, we don't want to support a home birth model. And so at a micro level, there's just a lack of support for models that are evidence-based. Why that is unbeknownst to me, because it's not an evidence-based idea. But, that at the micro level, and again, if you want to change something in government around something, this collaborative agreement, for example,
that took years.
Years, and there's doctors on every panel and on every advisory committee, and it's just sometimes the loudest voice in the room. It's really tricky.
Ultimately, there's the patriarchy is deeply in that fight as well.
Oh, yeah.
Well, Melanie, what you're doing, being a loud voice, a cute voice, pregnancy, but being a loud voice on stage and on the podcast and in the ways that you are online, sometimes that draws haters. Have you experienced the bully reality of the interwebs, or are you escaping it mostly?
I'm not escaping it. People, if you say, oh, I had this really mean comment online, people are like, oh, just ignore that. That's nothing. That's just people. Yeah, no, it just really hurts, when people say mean things online. But do you know what? The biggest thing online, I don't find that I don't get many. Like, I mean, there's bouts where you'll share something and this people will come out of the woodworks and you go, whoa, I've hit a nerve somewhere, or someone's posted somewhere else and everyone's come out to rally against this one video that I put up or something. I find it's not people who are outside of the birth world. The most hateful comments I get are from women who are inside the birth world, not pregnant women, other birth workers, other midwives.
For sure.
That's where it comes from. And that's the most hurtful. I don't think I could accept criticism from pregnant women or birthing women or postnatal women, breastfeeding women, because they're the community that I'd like to serve. And if they say, oh, wow, this really didn't feel good, I would be kind of more interested in changing my tact, for example. I'm like, oh, okay, that did not serve the community that I'm here to serve. So I need to change strategy here. but it's not usually from them. It's from within. I think it's deeply rooted in this sisterhood wound of, I don't know what it is, but it hits a nerve for somebody and just they get savage online,
That horizontal violence.
Yes. Yeah. And so I sometimes, if people, I appreciate critical comments that actually seek to kind of educate me in something. So, hey, when you said this, that could be really construed as, saying this to a particular group, and I'll think, whoa, I did not think of that. Thank you so much for sharing. But the comments that I will not engage with, and I've decided, like, I just have too much self-respect to engage with, other ones where people sort of come straight out of the bat and start calling names and making it a really personal thing. And I've had people poke me and say, well, aren't you gonna respond? And I'm like, oh, when you come out of the bat with this first line of engagement, I can see actually this is not going to be a respectful conversation. So I actually know I'm not engaging with this. So there's been, incidences, but now I just think they're not my people. They're not the people I'm trying to serve. So now if after sort of 2 attempts at simmering down the situation doesn't work, I just delete and block, because I'm like, you don't get to actually walk into my little carved out bit of the internet and hurl insults and then think that that's cool behavior. So on my social media, I'm very careful to make it a safe space, not only for myself, but for other people. So even if I see arguments within comments, and they are personally attacking each other, there'll be a little like, hey guys, we don't speak to each other in this space. And if it goes on, I just delete it. And people how dare you delete it? I'm like, no, this is my space. I have complete autonomy and control over this part of the internet. And so, I am going to take it down.
And you do of your part, like, like boundaries, right?
Yeah. You want to have a page that, takes other women down and calls them names and has screamy arguments. That's your prerogative, but I don't allow that on my page.
Thank goodness. Well, you have gathered together a bunch of birth workers, and I would love to know how you define, it's radical, right? That's the word.
What, Assembly of Rebellious Midwives?
Rebellious, that's it. Because in UK they have radical. So tell us what rebellious midwives is. What does that mean for you?
Okay. For me, being rebellious in this maternity care system, if you are interested in the evidence and seeing birth as a physiological event that sometimes needs medical care, that is a rebellious and countercultural perspective on birth.
That's so crazy, but yes.
Right. I mean, we don't have continuity of midwifery care as a standard in our country because we haven't built a maternity care system that is based around evidence. And we've got a nearly 40% cesarean section rate because people don't value physiology. We value medical management. So it's rebellious to value physiology as a sort of a standard and to value evidence when planning maternity care. And also, the current maternity care system doesn't value the autonomy of women in their decision making. And so it's a rebellious idea to be advocating for that. So that's what I advocate for, is women's autonomy to be the chief decision makers in their care. Evidence-based care that actually gives women information they can use to make their own decisions, not us telling women what's safe and what's dangerous, which is the whole idea of the podcast, is to give information in a way that women go, oh, I could use that to decide for myself what I think is safe and what is risky. And then also to value and promote midwifery-based and physiologically based sort of value physiological type of care. So that's, for me, what it means to be rebellious, because it's countercultural as to what's currently happening. And yes, so I'm not rebellious against everything, I'm not going to rebel against evidence-based papers, but I think I've been put in this position of being labeled a rebel because we're following the evidence and valuing the decision-making and autonomy of women. It makes you rebellious.
Such a radical concept. It's just, it is really, really humorous when you step back, right? I mean, it's brilliant. I'm so glad you're doing it. I feel absolutely akin to you because of those morals that have put you in this place. And yet when you take a step back and look at our culture, it's just like
Honestly,
so
mind-boggling. And people are like,
it's mind-boggling.
why aren't we doing more of this? I'm like, you tell me, I can't work it out. I've had to become a rebel just to share evidence-based information. So, I can't explain why we're here through a series of events, but this is where we are. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, one of the other places that we are, I think globally, certainly I see a rise in the US. I think I've heard tell of a rise of unassisted or free birth in Australia as well. Tell me about that and what's happening around that in your community.
Well, my PhD, which I finished in 2014, was about the decision women make to free birth or have a high-risk home birth. So where it
That's
fits.
what I thought. Yeah.
Yeah, two models that kind of fit outside the system, two ideas that sit outside the system. So why do women do that? When we understand why they do that, then we can actually predict when there will be an increase in free birth, right? So women do it when their options become limited, and free birth is then when they look at them all objectively, free birth becomes this shining opportunity at basically the best of a bad situation. I don't have many options, but if I had to pick one, free birth is presenting itself as the best. And that's because free birth means that women can hold on to the decision-making autonomy. No one will challenge their decision to have their family close to them and to choose who comes into their birth space. And they won't be exposed to as many interventions. They'll have a physiological birth. That's the kind of three main motivating factors behind women.
And then one more time, because I think this is a really important predictor, like you said. So they will have autonomy of decision making.
They don't want their autonomy challenged.
Yeah.
So this is they want to be in a space where they feel absolutely in control. No one's going to take that away from them. They get to call the shots. They want to stay close to their family and friends and be in control of who is in their birth space and when. And they want to have the opportunity at the lowest intervention birth possible.
Yeah, physiologic is the focus.
Yeah. So if we had a maternity care system that offered women those three things, then they have very few reasons to choose other options. If our services actually served women's needs, they would go there. So the more and more a service doesn't suit a woman's needs, that's where you start to increase the likelihood that they will abandon that service altogether and choose free birth. And so we saw this during COVID times, for example, where hospitals started to put more and more restrictions on women. I could have predicted it from a mile away that the minute you start to restrict women's autonomy and increase the medicalization and reduce access to their loved ones and change the way a service is delivered so that they won't have exactly what they want, they will leave. They don't just submit to a substandard system. A percentage will leave. And so that's what happened. And this is what will happen in times of upheaval. But also what's new that wasn't really around when I did my PhD was social media. And so now what we've got is a new layer, the influencer layer, where women who didn't realize that free birth could be an option. So, you gather a collection of dissatisfied women with the current services, paired with, there's new language around birth trauma and obstetric violence that's now allowing women to label their feelings, in a way that they can understand. And so you pair that coming out of obstetric violence and the language around birth trauma with social media influencers who are sort of shining a beacon on the idea of autonomous birth and free birth. And women start to look at hospital services very differently. They start to peg hospital services as a trauma point and a place that they want to avoid. And then they're given this very clear pathway to another option that could either involve home birth and midwives or free birth. And free birth has the benefit of being, I guess, low cost in a sense if you don't hire anyone. Although there are birth keepers and birth workers moving into that space at financial gain. So that's a whole other layer too. So, you start to commodify now the free birth option. And so there's this interesting dynamic. I'd say there is an increase. That it's not just one part. It's a whole lot of things working together. And, I've been a part of some of the dialogue around that with there's some looking into it, and from an academic perspective, having an understanding of why free birth happens. And, I completely understand why women free birth, and could almost, if you presented me a scenario, could tell you in which scenarios would definitely lead to an increase in free birth and what would help prevent it. And unfortunately, when people look at free birth and they think, oh, how do we stop women having free births? They will just come down heavy with legislation and almost borderline criminalize it. And that doesn't work, because you're working with a group of people who aren't interested in regulation or following any rules. They're just going to find another way to have the birth they want. So, the best option.
Well, and it's even more profound than that. I feel like we're talking about obstetric violence is human rights violation. So these folks are not looking it's not because they didn't have enough rules. It's because their rights were being violated. They're risking everything in order to stand on their own autonomy and sovereignty. That is so, it's literally asinine to criminalize a process that women are obviously that's the symptom, not the cause.
Correct. Yes. So women can definitely still do it, but they don't think to themselves, oh, maybe if we made our services more humane, maybe that would be a solution to this problem. But they don't think like that. They just think, how do we force them back into the system by putting, but that won't happen. You just have to make the services that women are accessing, make them appropriate for women. They're just currently not. And that's why they free birth, because, and so the big finding from my research was that women will, most of the time, choose the birth option that feels best and safest. And in this context, free birth presented itself as the best and safest option when women had a look at their options. And safety is not just about physical safety.
Yeah, it's such a powerful overlay, this concept of high levels of reported obstetric violence, a 40% cesarean, and limitations on who can be in the room with you in the hospital, on top of free birth. It's kind of obviously, duh, of course that's what's happening, And yet the system just refuses to acknowledge it.
When you talk to people about obstetric violence, they're like, no, we're trying to keep them safe. That's why we're doing these things. We're not trying to hurt them. We're trying to make sure that they're safe. And you're like, you do not understand safety. If you think that what you're doing is keeping them safe, but they're turning around and saying to you, what you did to me has scarred me for life. And then they said, I didn't mean to. I was trying to keep you safe. That's coming from a position of just not understanding. If somebody says to you, what you did to me in my birth has left me with long-standing trauma, the next question is, please explain to me, I want to understand that. What did I do that made you feel that way? And come from a place of, how can I make sure I never do this again? And
that's not what's happening. Instead, they're being like, that wasn't violence. That didn't hurt you. They're just completely gaslighting a whole generation.
Yeah. And then women say, well, fine, if you're not going to listen, we're going to take this into our own hands. We're going to find a midwife, or we're going to free birth. We want out of this system that it refuses to serve us in the way we want to be served. And then when we are the victims of that system, they refuse to acknowledge that they've done anything wrong. So, women just are starting to realize and decide.
Yeah. And then there's the commodification of this freedom place, which is happening everywhere too. And I suppose that is the product of capitalistic economy that most of us live in. And also, it's not all capitalism. A lot of it is a desire to serve, and women have that, and a desire to be supported, and women have that too. It's just it's not catching up it feels like it's going faster than we can. I don't know. What would you say about this?
Well, I
This
think the tricky thing is I think if a woman hires, a birth keeper or a doula or somebody to serve them in their birth space, then that's completely fine. That's their prerogative. I think the difference is how that person defines their role in that space and what they're being paid to do. So, there's circumstances here in Australia where the line is being blurred. Women wanted midwives, but they couldn't afford one, so they hired somebody else who kind of claimed to have those kind of skills, but it became obvious that they didn't, and the parents were like, whoa, what did we do? We hired the wrong person. This person didn't have the skills we wanted them for. We actually wanted a home birth midwife, but instead we're in this scenario. So, and then there's this underlying demonization of midwives where some people in the free birthing community will actually actively discourage women from pursuing midwives. And that comes out of a deep distrust of the system and seeing midwives as part of the system. And it doesn't appreciate the nuance that some midwives are able to work outside of it, not under their full supervision. We're still registered, so there is a restriction, but I think that restriction is overstated, and there's a real investment by some birth workers to keep peddling this false messaging that midwives are all bad. And I see that as just as damaging as, obstetricians who say every birth should happen in hospital with a doctor. That's the safest way. Then there's the other extreme of, birth workers who say every birth, we don't need midwives. We can do this on our own. I think it's equally as damaging messaging. And I'm confident to say that because there's so much evidence behind the work of midwifery as a safe and equitable way of providing maternity care. But the problem is that midwifery has been corrupted by this medical messaging, and not all midwives are kind of still sitting in that with woman mindset that we're supposed to be raised in and supposed to be understanding and appreciating and supporting physiological birth. Some midwives are hijacked into that medical mindset. And that's what I think women find hard is they want midwifery care, but they don't know which type of midwife they're getting. Am I getting a midwife who's going to respect my autonomy and the physiology of birth, or am I getting one that's bought into this medical mindset? So it's this really confusing place. And I think, some people...
Yeah, it's very confusing.
Yeah.
And in the US, it becomes, there's actually 5 different titles of midwives, 5 different types of midwives. And there's then 50 different laws because every state has a different law. So it is madness to try to figure out who you're getting.
This is the thing. And then people are like overstating the risks of like, all midwives are this. I'm like, well, hang on a second. Not all midwives are that. There are certainly a proportion. Yeah. What we need to be doing is helping women decipher which one did you get? Like, how can you work out who you've got before you're in too deep in a way? There's some easy ways of working that out. But yeah, I think there's so much infighting that it's very hard for women to see the information through the infighting. And I think that's the root of a lot of the social media ugliness that happens. And
and of course that, I mean, as challenging as it can be to be the recipient of that, we can also kind of take a step back and be like, I know where that comes from. That is the result of marginalization and criminalization and delegitimization. That is the result of what the obstetric model has been seeking to do for 100 years or more. And that's the outcome there. So it's like there can be some compassion around how we got to that place.
Yeah. And I think, though, if we can acknowledge that the patriarchy has strategically pit us against each other, because if you can make women infight, we're not going to make progress in any field, in any place that we're trying to go. If we don't go together, then it won't work. So there's a strategic reason women have been groomed to take each other down, because that will stifle our progress. So if we realize that in every interaction and we think, am I bringing this woman up or am I trying to take her down? Then, whenever I respond to women to anybody really online. I think, right, we need to frame whatever you're going to say next needs to be something that's going to bring this person up instead of taking them back or down. Because when you take someone down, they have to put time and energy into propping themselves back up again, you know, and that takes away energy.
Well, you take yourself down. I mean, that's what happens. If you truly believe we're in it together, then any action towards another is an action towards self, you know?
Yeah.
Like, so it is, I mean, that's absolutely how I've seen it as well. And I'm like, I just remain silent. And that's why, because this does not help me, the cause, them, humanity. This does not move any needle forward. So you just have to stay silent sometimes. But that's like a bit of a spiritual process sometimes when you're go through
I think there's an element of emotional maturity that's involved in taking that position as well. You know, some personal reflection. You know, when someone says something to me, I always think, oh, do I need to be changing and improving myself in some way? Like, have I missed something? You know, it's just,
it's a balance. Yeah. Well, Melanie, what is next for you? What kind of plans do you have in your future? Where are you going?
Yeah, well, this year I took a big leap of hiring 2 full-time staff to help me.
Good for you. I'm cheering for you.
Yes, I sort of was looking at things and thinking, I got all this stuff I want to do, but there's no way I can do it on my own. Or if I do it on my own, I'm going to have a very unhealthy body, unhealthy family. It's not a good way of working. So my intentionality is to be working a full 3 days a week at doing the very best things that I can do, my top 20% of my skill, and to defer the other 80% of whatever needs doing through the week to other people who are super skilled in that thing. So that's my kind of life strategy. So at the moment, I've got, 2 full-time staff and lots of little subcontractors who are helping me do all that. And things are growing and, you know, word is spreading and the podcast is great and the conference is growing. And so I want to keep nurturing those projects. I have plans to write a book, the Great Birth Rebellion book, which is all about how to have a great birth. And so I need to now consider, okay, how does that, do I hire another person? What would they do? So actually, like in the next few weeks, me and my team are meeting of like, okay, what jobs are there that none of us like doing, but have to be done? And who can we find the person who just desperately wants to do that job? So I'm as well as being an academic and a midwife and invested in helping to change the birth landscape, I am just as much a businesswoman. And I see that very much as a creative place, like an artistic place to be. And I feel like there's strategy and things that are involved in how I'm executing this purpose. So I'm keen to hone that and get really good at that. Again, it's not, for me, it's not about money, although that's really nice that I can live off the work that I'm doing. For me, it's about how can I be a big influential voice in this space for the purpose of women. I don't just want to be this big shiny face that everyone goes, oh, it's Mel. Like, no, I want you to just, you know, the people out there to benefit from my work, as many people as possible to benefit from my work. So that's what's coming for me is a balanced way of doing business in that I can be available to my children and family because we homeschool as well. So it's, you know, they're always here and just nurture my health so that I can keep doing this for like another 30 or 40 years. You know, I'm 40. There's so many years to keep working and I can't be doing it at 110% because that's not sustainable. So that is in a nutshell the plan for me this year.
That's awesome. Well, if there's anything Midwifery Wisdom or I can do to support you, please don't hesitate to call on us. It's a grand mission. It's exciting.
Wow. Okay. Very exciting. Yes. I keep just noticing what's happening out in the world. And I love the idea of just, you know, this huge web of collaboration where, again, you know, there's all these people who are doing amazing things in the birth world, and then asking other people, hey, how can I help you? How can I move your purposes forward? How can we do this together? And certainly the All for Maternity group who run the Practicing Midwives Journal in the UK, they've reached out. Like,
another great group.
Like, how can we work together? How can we do this? Anna and Sheena Byram, and they're coming to the Convergence of Rebellious Midwives this coming year, 2025 as well. So I just want to encourage midwives to work collaboratively and collegially. And if ever you feel yourself trying to compete against another woman or midwife, just push that aside and remind yourself that we're actually all working together for the same purpose. And if we go together, we're actually going to grow what we can do instead of, So that's kind of where I'm at philosophically in a lot of ways.
I love that. And that is where we need to be. So excited to cheer for you as a leader in this space, because it's so important. Yeah, if you want the download on any of the best speakers, we just hosted 3 conferences in the last 3 years in the US. So if you want any download on some great speakers from the US, I can hook you up.
Oh, yeah. I am keen to know. Yeah. And I mean, I still can't get past the fact that you describing me as the way that you see my work. I just don't understand. I'm like, what is going on out there?
Well, it's okay. It's not for you to understand. You just make it and release it, and then the people take it how they will. And you touched a nerve for sure. There's something about your countenance that really draws people in, and that's a really profound and powerful skill that you can't make up. It just is. It's who you are.
All right. Yeah. Cool. Awesome.
Yeah. Well, we will be cheering for wherever we are in the world. I'll cheer for you. And really appreciate this conversation. Really appreciated getting to know you more, and you laid out some really important truths. Thanks so much.
Thanks for having me. Yeah, I appreciate it.
Well, stay in touch. Thanks.
Okay. Farewell.
Bye.
Hey friends, this episode with Melanie marks the end of season 5. We'll be taking a short break for a couple of weeks, but we'll be back soon with an exciting global adventure. In season 6, we will continue to travel around the world, meeting midwives from different countries to hear about their wins, challenges, and the incredible ways that they are making a difference. Our hope is that these stories will inspire you and remind us that we are all part of a global sisterhood, working together for safe, compassionate maternity care. Until then, take care and make sure you're subscribed to our newsletter at midwiferywisdom.com to stay up to date. See you soon!